A day in the park. Dylan strode through the park, a place he had walked through countless times, but never before with the purpose he now carried. Today, he was a man who had it all: youth, ambition, and a title that placed him at the pinnacle of success in the corporate world. His suit, expertly tailored and pristine, gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of his hard-won achievements. The shoes he wore were polished to perfection, catching the sun's reflection with every confident step he took. A smug smile played on his lips as he surveyed his surroundings, feeling an overwhelming sense of superiority. The people walking around him seemed to fade into the background, their lives insignificant compared to his own. He was the youngest senior manager in the company's history, no small feat in a place that prided itself on merit. His thoughts swirled with the image of his promotion, the congratulatory emails from his colleagues, and the image of himself at the top of the corporate ladder. He had worked tirelessly to get here, and now it was time to enjoy the fruits of his labor. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and without hesitation, he pulled it out. A quick glance revealed another email from his boss, Mr. Hamilton, asking for an update on the latest project. Dylan, of course, had already completed everything well ahead of schedule, but the thought of impressing his boss even more with an additional, unnecessary update crossed his mind. The idea of being indispensable thrilled him. As he walked past the park's manicured gardens and paths, Dylan caught sight of a few familiar faces: co-workers, joggers, and the occasional dog walker. His presence didn't go unnoticed. He was used to this. People admired him, respected him even, and he made sure they knew it. Just then, Dylan heard a faint voice, a soft, almost imperceptible sound carried by the gentle breeze. It came from a woman sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. Dylan's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed her. She was an older black woman, with deep weathered skin that spoke of years lived with resilience. Her clothes were ragged, worn from years of use. A torn coat, stained and frayed at the edges, hung loosely around her thin frame. Her shoes were scuffed, no longer recognizable as anything other than a desperate attempt to hold on to some semblance of comfort. Dylan's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and he couldn't help but feel a rush of superiority. This woman, sitting in the park with a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Please help," was a stark contrast to him. Everything about her life seemed to be in disarray. She was a stranger in a park full of people, barely noticed by the world around her. It was then that the old, familiar arrogance stirred within Dylan, a voice deep within him, one that had carried him through his corporate rise, spoke up, urging him to assert his superiority. He couldn't resist. With a calculated step forward, Dylan moved closer to the bench where the woman sat. He made sure to walk with an air of dominance, his posture straight, and his chest puffed out. His gaze swept over her once more before he spoke, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey," Dylan began, his tone loud enough for her to hear clearly. "You know, I've seen people do some pretty desperate things to get attention, but this is a new low. Sitting here, asking for handouts in the middle of a park. Seriously, you think anyone's going to take pity on you?" The woman didn't respond right away, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her, perhaps lost in her thoughts. Dylan, undeterred, continued, "How about you try actually working for a living?" he said with a scoff. "You know, like the rest of us. I bet that'd be a little too much effort, though, huh?" Dylan could feel the rush of satisfaction as the words left his mouth. He watched as the woman finally lifted her eyes, slowly turning her head toward him. Her gaze was steady, almost serene, despite the harshness of his words. There was something about the way she looked at him that caught him off guard, something calm, almost unfazed. For a brief moment, Dylan felt a twinge of doubt, but it was quickly washed away by his own smugness. He chuckled to himself and turned to walk away, certain that the woman would retreat back into her silent existence. But as he turned his back, something strange happened. Instead of silence, he heard the faintest voice, a whisper that barely reached his ears. Your pride will be your downfall. Dylan froze in his tracks, a ripple of confusion spreading through him. He turned back to look at the woman, but she was already looking down at her sign again, as if she hadn't spoken. Her lips were pressed together in a quiet contemplation, her expression neutral once more. The word hung in the air, and for a moment, Dylan felt the unsettling sensation of being watched, judged, and, for the first time in a long time, small. Shaking off the feeling, he brushed it off as nothing more than his overactive imagination. He had bigger things to focus on today. The promotion, the congratulations, the respect that was rightfully his. As Dylan continued walking, heading toward the park cafe where his colleagues were waiting for him, his mind lingered for just a moment longer on the woman's cryptic words. What had she meant? It was ridiculous to think that someone like her could have any insight into his life. His success was tangible, proven. Nothing and no one could take that away from him. The cafe was just ahead, its modern glass windows reflecting the warmth of the sun. Dylan could already see his colleagues gathered inside, talking and laughing among themselves, clearly enjoying their afternoon. He felt a sense of superiority once more as he approached the entrance, his confidence returning like an old friend. But something had shifted, if only slightly, in the back of his mind. A small seed of doubt had been planted, and as Dylan opened the door to the cafe, he was blissfully unaware that it was about to grow into something far more significant than he could have ever imagined. Inside, the usual group of colleagues greeted him with smiles and nods of approval. They were used to Dylan's brash self-assurance, his tendency to boast about his accomplishments. But today, there was something different in his demeanor. He couldn't quite place it, but there was an underlying tension. It wasn't just the weight of the promotion he had to brag about, nor the need to bask in his own glory. It was something more. He sat down at the table with his colleagues, adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, and took a deep breath. "So, guess who just got promoted to senior manager?" Dylan said, flashing a grin and leaning back in his chair. He couldn't resist the urge to announce his achievement, but there was a sense of unease in his chest. "You don't say," one of his colleagues said, a bit too casually. "Congratulations, Dylan. That's awesome." Dylan's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His mind kept drifting back to the park bench, to the woman who had spoken those words, and to the strange feeling that had accompanied her gaze. But no matter. This was his moment. The others were listening to him, as they always did. The attention was on him, and that's all that mattered. He had everything he needed to feel secure in the world. Or so he thought. What Dylan didn't know was that his boss, Mr. Hamilton, had been sitting at a nearby table in the cafe, just out of sight. Dylan had walked right past him on his way in, oblivious to the fact that the CEO of the company had witnessed everything. The taunting, the arrogance, and the mockery of the woman in the park. And as Mr. Hamilton sipped his coffee, his sharp eyes had followed Dylan's every move. The seeds of Dylan's downfall had already been sown, and now it was only a matter of time before the consequences of his actions began to take root. The ripple effect. Dylan Stroh couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had settled deep in his chest as he sipped his overpriced cappuccino and engaged in small talk with his colleagues at the cafe. A thought, one that he couldn't quite place, kept creeping into his mind. The woman in the park, the taunts, her calm demeanor, and the strange words she had whispered to him. "Your pride will be your downfall." He kept telling himself it was just an offhand remark, probably nothing more than a desperate attempt at some wisdom from a homeless woman who had nothing to lose. But for some reason, the phrase haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. He could hear his colleagues laughing, but their voices seemed distant, as if they were coming from another room. Dylan's mind drifted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt out of control. He couldn't help but wonder about the woman's words. It didn't make sense. Downfall. He was on top of the world. He had just received the biggest promotion his company had ever offered to someone his age. What did she know about downfall? Dylan's gaze wandered across the cafe, briefly meeting the eyes of his boss, Mr. Hamilton, who was sitting a few tables away. The older man had a calm, inscrutable expression as he watched Dylan, his steely blue eyes observing him with a subtle intensity. Mr. Hamilton's presence always carried weight, especially in moments like this. Dylan had learned long ago not to underestimate the man's sharp intuition. He could read people like an open book, and his disapproval was something that could shatter careers in an instant. But today, Mr. Hamilton wasn't saying anything. He was just watching, a silent observer, as Dylan and his colleagues carried on with their banter. It wasn't long before Dylan's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a casual email. It was a notification from his assistant about a company meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. The subject of the meeting was confidential, but the message mentioned that Mr. Hamilton would be in attendance. Dylan felt a brief wave of anxiety ripple through him. He had nothing to worry about, of course. He had been promoted, after all. But something about the meeting felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would shift the course of his life. The thought of the woman's words and the presence of Mr. Hamilton combined to create a subtle tension that hung over Dylan like a storm cloud. He didn't understand why his mind kept returning to that park bench. Why did the woman's calm demeanor, her gaze, linger in his thoughts? Dylan excused himself from the table and walked toward the restroom, his mind racing. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, trying to make sense of the disquiet gnawing at him. The image before him was exactly as he wanted it, perfect, polished, and powerful. His tailored suit fit like a glove, his designer watch gleamed under the bathroom lights, and his well-coiffed hair was exactly how he had left it. Yet, something was off. He couldn't quite identify what it was, but it was there, a whisper in the back of his mind, a subtle unease he hadn't felt before. As he washed his hands, he stared into the mirror once more, trying to reassure himself. Come on, Dylan. You've got everything. You've earned everything. You're the youngest senior manager in the company. There's nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. But the words didn't feel as convincing as they once would have. The reflection staring back at him seemed foreign, as if it didn't entirely belong to him. Returning to the table, Dylan felt the weight of his boss's presence intensify. Mr. Hamilton, now seated at the bar of the cafe, continued to watch him with quiet intensity. There was something about the way Mr. Hamilton observed him that sent a chill down Dylan's spine. When Dylan sat back down with his colleagues, the conversation shifted to the upcoming project, a massive undertaking that would decide the future of the company. It was a golden opportunity for Dylan, one that would solidify his reputation as a rising star within the firm. However, as his colleagues spoke excitedly about the details of the project, Dylan found himself unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the woman in the park and Mr. Hamilton's watchful gaze. The meeting was fast approaching, and Dylan couldn't help but wonder if it was all somehow connected. Maybe the woman had been right. Maybe there was more to life than just corporate titles and financial success. As the clock ticked closer to the hour, Dylan's heart began to race. He excused himself from the table again, this time heading out of the cafe and into the bustling streets of the city. The air was colder now, a reminder that winter was just around the corner. His phone buzzed once more, but this time, he ignored it. He needed a moment to himself. The world outside seemed to move faster as Dylan walked, his feet carrying him instinctively back to the park. The idea of returning there felt strange, but it was as though something, some force, was pulling him back to the place where his arrogance had first collided with reality. The park, where he had mocked that woman, and the words she had spoken, echoed in his mind as if they were calling him back. As he entered the park once more, the sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the pathways. The benches were empty, the usual joggers and dog walkers nowhere to be seen. Dylan walked slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings until, at the far end of the park, he spotted the woman once more. She was still there, sitting on the same bench, just as he had left her. But something had changed. Her presence seemed more profound now, almost as if the entire park was holding its breath in anticipation. Dylan approached hesitantly, his steps unsure. The woman didn't look up this time, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her. "Hey," Dylan said, his voice quieter than it had been before. I've been thinking about what you said earlier." The woman didn't respond, but Dylan could feel her awareness, her eyes still focused on the earth beneath her. He took another tentative step forward. "I didn't mean what I said earlier," he continued. I've had some time to think. And I don't know. Maybe you were right." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Dylan wondered if she would say anything at all. He almost regretted approaching her. But then the woman lifted her eyes, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a smile of pity or judgment. It was one of understanding, one that seemed to carry the weight of years of lived experience. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" she said softly, her voice full of quiet wisdom. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. For the first time since he had entered the park, he felt a sense of humility, something that had been completely absent from his life until now. Something had shifted, something that he couldn't quite understand, but that was undeniable. Before Dylan could respond, he felt the sudden, undeniable sensation of being watched. He turned, and to his shock, Mr. Hamilton stood just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on Dylan with an expression that was impossible to read. In that moment, Dylan realized that the forces at play were far greater than he could have imagined. The woman's words were not just a reflection of his pride. They were a warning. And now, standing in the park with Mr. Hamilton watching him, Dylan knew that the transformation he was about to undergo would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone around him. The ripple effect had begun. The weight of consequences. Dylan's mind raced as he stood in the park, staring at Mr. Hamilton, his boss, who had suddenly materialized out of nowhere. The quiet intensity in the older man's eyes was unyielding. He had witnessed everything. The mockery, the arrogance, and the way Dylan had seemingly disregarded the humanity of the woman sitting on the bench. For a long, uncomfortable moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze rustled through the leaves of the nearby trees, but it felt like the world had paused, holding its breath. Dylan could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud and insistent, as if it were trying to break through the suffocating silence. Mr. Hamilton's eyes never wavered from Dylan's face, and there was a sharpness in his gaze that made the younger man's stomach twist. Dylan had always admired the CEO's ability to remain calm, to remain composed, even in the face of chaos. But now, standing before him, he couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. The homeless woman, who had remained silent during the exchange, now slowly stood from the bench, her movements deliberate and measured. Dylan couldn't tear his eyes away from her. Despite her ragged appearance, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, something that resonated deeply within him. It was as though she, too, had been waiting for this moment, for the undeniable collision of arrogance and humility that had been set in motion the moment Dylan mocked her. Well, Dylan," Mr. Hamilton's voice finally broke the silence, his tone measured but firm. "It seems that fate has a way of bringing things to the surface when we least expect it." Dylan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. Was he supposed to apologize? Was he supposed to explain himself? Was there any way to undo the damage he had caused? Nothing seemed adequate in the face of Mr. Hamilton's scrutiny. "Mr. Hamilton," Dylan began, but the older man raised his hand, cutting him off. "I didn't come here to hear excuses, Dylan," Mr. Hamilton said softly, but with an authority that sent a chill down his spine. "I came here to see what kind of man you truly are." The weight of those words hit Dylan harder than anything he had ever felt. He was used to being admired for his work ethic, his ambition, his rise through the company ranks. He was used to being congratulated for his achievements, praised for his drive and intelligence. But this was different. This wasn't about his ability to secure a deal or outwit a competitor. This was about something far more fundamental: his character, his humanity, and his capacity for empathy. Dylan's mind flashed back to the moment in the cafe, where he had boasted about his promotion with such arrogance. He had basked in the praise, reveling in the attention. But in the face of Mr. Hamilton's steady gaze, all of that felt hollow. What was the point of all his achievements if they came at the expense of his humanity? The woman, who had been standing silently beside him, spoke now, her voice low but filled with quiet wisdom. "I don't need your pity, son," she said, her eyes meeting Dylan's, "but I hope one day you'll understand that the true measure of a person isn't in how high they climb, but in how they treat those who have nothing." Dylan's throat tightened, and he felt a rush of guilt sweep over him. Her words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing into the fortress of self-importance he had spent so long building. He had always believed that success was about achieving more, acquiring more, and proving his worth to the world. But the woman's words shattered that illusion, exposing the emptiness that lay beneath the surface. Mr. Hamilton, who had been observing the exchange quietly, finally spoke again. "It's easy to look down on others when you have everything," he said, his voice low but laden with meaning. "But real leaders, Dylan, real leaders don't look down on people. They lift them up." Dylan wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he had worked hard for everything he had achieved. He wanted to remind Mr. Hamilton of his promotion, his accomplishments, and the countless hours he had poured into his career. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, a deep sense of shame washed over him, and he found himself at a loss for words. "You're right," Dylan finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been blind. I've been so focused on proving myself that I've lost sight of what really matters." The woman smiled gently at him, and for the first time, Dylan saw a flicker of kindness in her eyes. "It's never too late to change, son," she said. "All it takes is a little humility. And maybe, just maybe, a little compassion." Mr. Hamilton nodded in agreement. "Humility is a powerful thing, Dylan," he said. "And it's something you'll need to move forward in this world, whether you're in a boardroom or a park. The choices you make now will shape the person you become, the person you want to be." Dylan stood there, his mind reeling. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that his path to success was the only one that mattered. But in that moment, everything had shifted. He realized that the real measure of his worth wasn't in how much money he earned or how high he climbed in the corporate world, but in how he treated people, how he valued them, not for what they could give him, but for who they were. A heavy silence hung in the air, and for the first time in years, Dylan felt truly small, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that made him realize how much he still had to learn. He had spent so much time elevating himself, trying to prove that he was deserving of respect, that he had lost sight of the very thing that made him human, his connection to others. Mr. Hamilton placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder, breaking him from his thoughts. "You've got potential, Dylan," he said, his tone softer now. "But it's going to take more than just business acumen to succeed. It's going to take heart. It's going to take courage to look at yourself, truly look, and ask if you're the person you want to be." Dylan nodded, his chest tightening as he absorbed the weight of Mr. Hamilton's words. He had always prided himself on being strong, on never showing weakness, but now, in the face of this quiet confrontation, he felt his armor cracking. He felt exposed. The homeless woman, who had been silent for the past few moments, offered a final piece of advice. "Don't let your pride blind you," she said. "Let it be your heart that leads you. You'll find that it can take you farther than any promotion ever will." Dylan stood there, feeling the words wash over him like a baptism. For the first time, he truly understood what she meant. It wasn't about the position or the paycheck. It was about the kind of person he was becoming and the legacy he would leave behind. He glanced at Mr. Hamilton, who gave him a small nod, as though silently acknowledging the transformation taking place before his eyes. "Thank you," Dylan said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure if it was the woman's wisdom or Mr. Hamilton's quiet support that had unlocked something inside him. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly humbled. The woman smiled, and for the first time, Dylan noticed something extraordinary about her, a quiet grace that belied her circumstances. She wasn't just a homeless woman. She was someone who had lived through struggles and emerged with wisdom that Dylan couldn't even begin to comprehend. As she turned to leave, she gave Dylan one final piece of advice. Life's not about how high you can go, but how deeply you can touch the lives of others along the way. Dylan watched as she walked away, her silhouette fading into the evening light. In that moment, everything changed. The park, the cafe, the promotion. It all seemed so trivial in comparison to what he had just learned. And as he stood there, he made a silent promise to himself. He would be better. He would change. He would no longer let his pride define him. He would lead with his heart, the unraveling of the self. The days following that moment in the park seemed to stretch on in a strange, almost surreal haze. Dylan had expected to feel relief after the conversation with Mr. Hamilton and the woman. He had expected that some part of him would snap back into the person he had been before. But that didn't happen. Instead, the conversation continued to echo in his mind, each passing hour making the words seem heavier, more profound. Dylan had returned to his apartment that evening with a sense of unease gnawing at him. His mind wandered back to the woman, to Mr. Hamilton's words, and most of all, to his own reflections. What kind of person had he become? How had he let himself get so far off course? He had always considered himself a go-getter, a man who had clawed his way to the top, who had earned his place at the table. But now, it felt like the very foundation he had built his life upon was beginning to crack. It wasn't the typical existential crisis that plagued many in their late 20s. This wasn't about wondering if he had chosen the right career path or if he was living his best life. No, this was something deeper, something more unsettling. It was as if Dylan had suddenly realized that his entire identity, the person he had worked so hard to become, was built on a false premise. He had always believed that success, achievement, and recognition would bring him fulfillment. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how empty the pursuit had felt in the moments when it truly mattered. At the office the next morning, Dylan sat at his desk, surrounded by a sea of paperwork, memos, and digital notifications. The usual hum of the corporate machine was in full swing, people rushing to meetings, conversations about projections, and profit margins happening in the background. Everything around him felt unchanged, but he felt completely different. He found himself unable to focus on the numbers or the analysis in front of him. The spreadsheets seemed like a distant blur. His thoughts kept drifting back to the park, to that woman, to the weight of the conversation. His arrogance, his boastfulness, his obsession with success. What did it all mean now? What good was it to be the youngest senior manager in the company if he had lost the ability to connect with people on a real level? The office had always been his sanctuary, the place where he felt most at home. But now, as he looked around the sleek, polished surfaces and the endless walls of glass, he felt a deep sense of alienation. It wasn't just the people, many of whom he had once considered friends or colleagues. It was the entire culture of the company, the very air he had breathed in for so long. For the first time, he questioned the things he had once held so dear. Was this really the life he wanted? Mr. Hamilton had called for a meeting that afternoon, a routine check-in for the senior leadership team to discuss the company's ongoing projects. As usual, Dylan walked into the conference room, his suit perfectly tailored, his posture confident, his face an unreadable mask. But today, he felt a strange disconnect. The usual exchange of pleasantries, the back-and-forth banter, all of it felt hollow, like actors playing their parts in a show where the audience had left long ago. As the meeting unfolded, Dylan's mind wandered, and he caught snippets of conversation that made him feel like an outsider in his own company. The talk centered around increasing revenue, cutting costs, expanding market share, and staying ahead of competitors. It was the same rhetoric he had heard countless times before, but today it left him feeling more disconnected than ever. Mr. Hamilton's voice, calm and commanding, snapped him back to attention. "Dylan, would you like to share your thoughts on the upcoming product launch?" For the first time in a long while, Dylan felt a moment of hesitation. The words he had so confidently prepared in his mind seemed to evaporate as he stared at Mr. Hamilton's expectant gaze. What was the point? He had spent so much time crafting his answers to meet the expectations of his colleagues, but now everything felt trivial. Dylan cleared his throat, pushing the unease aside. "Yes, of course. I think we're in a strong position to dominate the market with this launch," he began, his voice sounding foreign to him, as though it belonged to someone else. "We've got a solid strategy in place, and the numbers look promising." He paused, unsure of what else to add. His usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Mr. Hamilton, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. "You're right, Dylan," he said. "But remember, strategy and numbers aren't everything. This launch is about more than just the market share. It's about the people we're serving. It's about connecting with them, understanding their needs. You need to remember that, especially as a leader." Dylan's heart skipped a beat as Mr. Hamilton's words settled in his mind. The phrase "understanding their needs" lingered in the air, the weight of it growing heavier by the second. It wasn't just about the numbers, the market, or the competition. It was about the people, their lives, their experiences, and how his company's products could impact them. Suddenly, the realization hit him. His role as senior manager wasn't just about making the company more profitable. It was about serving the people who relied on his decisions, the people whose lives his company's products touched. And he had been so focused on his own success, so consumed by his ambition, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly serve others. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, Dylan only half listening as the discussions continued. His thoughts were no longer in the conference room. They were elsewhere, back in the park, with the woman, with the quiet words she had shared with him. She had been right. Humility and compassion were far more valuable than any promotion or paycheck. After the meeting, Dylan found himself walking aimlessly through the office, his mind awash with conflicting emotions. He felt like a stranger in a world he had once dominated. The pride that had driven him for so long now felt like a heavy burden, one that he was no longer sure he wanted to carry. He found his way to the break room, and as he grabbed a cup of coffee, he noticed a familiar face, a colleague he had worked with for years, Jane, who had always been kind and patient with him. She was sitting at one of the tables, sipping her own coffee and reading something on her phone. Dylan hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach her, but something inside him urged him to go over. He sat down across from her, the weight of his thoughts making it hard to speak. Jane looked up, her expression warm. "Hey, Dylan. Everything okay? You seem off today." Dylan hesitated before speaking, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I don't know, Jane," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about the kind of person I've become." Jane raised an eyebrow, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "What do you mean?" Dylan ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "I've spent so much time focusing on my career, on climbing the ladder, that I'd lost sight of what really matters. I've been arrogant, and I've treated people poorly, people I should have treated with more respect." Jane's expression softened, and she put down her phone, focusing entirely on him. "Dylan, I think you're a good person at heart. You've just been caught up in things, but it's never too late to change. You can always make it right." Her words struck something deep within him, and for the first time in a long while, Dylan felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't beyond redemption. He could still change. He could still make things right. Dylan looked up at Jane, a new determination rising within him. "Thanks, Jane. I think I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm ready to start." And with that, Dylan took his first real step toward change. The road ahead would be long, and it would require humility empathy, and a willingness to challenge the very identity he had spent so long building. But as he sat there, he realized that he was no longer afraid of the journey. The first step toward becoming the person he wanted to be had already begun. The humbling path. The weeks that followed were anything but easy. Dylan's days at the office were filled with an overwhelming sense of discomfort, a sharp contrast to the confident, almost arrogant swagger he had once carried with him like a second skin. The promotion to senior manager still clung to him like an empty badge, one that no longer seemed to have the same significance it once did. As he walked the polished hallways of the company, surrounded by employees who still respected him for his professional achievements, Dylan began to feel like an imposter in his own life. He had tried to make small changes in his behavior, smiling more, listening instead of talking, and offering assistance where he could. But it wasn't enough. The realization that his success had come at the expense of meaningful relationships weighed heavily on him. He had always thought that working harder, achieving more, and earning recognition would lead to fulfillment. Now he realized how wrong he had been. One of the first signs that his transformation was truly beginning came when he sat down with one of his team members, Nadia. She had been working under him for a year, and although they had interacted countless times, their conversations had always been transactional, focused only on performance metrics or deadlines. But this time, Dylan decided to change the dynamic. Nadia had come to his office with a project update, her usual efficiency and professionalism on display. Dylan motioned for her to sit, the offer unspoken but understood. He wanted to know her thoughts, her ideas, her struggles, not just about work, but about her life. He had begun to understand that people were more than just employees. They were human beings with aspirations, dreams, and challenges of their own. "Hey, Nadia," Dylan began, trying to sound casual but sincere. "How's everything going outside of work? You seem a little stressed these days. Anything I can do to help?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected question. Nadia had always been a diligent worker, but the personal side of her life had always been an unspoken boundary between them. She glanced at him warily for a moment before letting out a quiet sigh. "It's been tough, honestly," she admitted, her voice low. "I've been juggling a lot. Work, family, my personal goals. Some days it feels like it's all too much." Dylan nodded thoughtfully. For the first time in a long while, he genuinely wanted to know more, not out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to understand. "I get that. Life can be overwhelming. You've been doing great work, Nadia, but I want you to know you don't have to shoulder everything alone. If there's anything I can do to ease the load, whether at work or just listening, please let me know." Nadia looked at him for a moment, as though weighing his sincerity, before giving a small, grateful smile. "I appreciate that, Dylan. Honestly, I think it's just a matter of balancing everything. But it's nice to know you're here." For the first time, Dylan didn't feel like he was talking down to someone from a place of superiority. He didn't feel the need to be the big boss, constantly in control of the conversation. In that moment, he simply felt like a person, connecting with another person. It was these small interactions that began to shift his perspective. Dylan knew he wasn't perfect, and he wasn't naive enough to believe he could completely change overnight. But the effort was there. He had become more aware of his words and actions, striving to treat everyone around him with respect and understanding. However, this new mindset didn't come without its challenges. One of the hardest adjustments for Dylan was facing the lingering tension with some of his colleagues. Not everyone appreciated his newfound humility. There were still those in the office who clung to the old Dylan, the one who flaunted his success, who spoke in self-congratulatory tones, and who barely acknowledged anyone who wasn't on his level. These individuals eyed him warily, unsure of how to deal with the more introspective version of their senior manager. One afternoon, Dylan found himself in a meeting with a few of his colleagues, including Alex, a longtime associate who had always been part of the group that celebrated his rise to the top. Alex was a sharp, ambitious individual, and Dylan knew he had always seen him as a kindred spirit. But something was different today. Alex's tone was sharper than usual, and he seemed to be purposefully trying to provoke Dylan. "So, Dylan," Alex began, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "I hear you've been making some changes. Not really the same guy who used to demand perfection from the team every time, huh?" Dylan felt the old defensive impulse stir within him. He knew exactly what Alex was getting at, trying to poke holes in his transformation, to make him feel weak for choosing a path of humility over dominance. But instead of reacting with irritation or deflection, Dylan took a deep breath and met Alex's gaze, his voice steady. "I'm still the same person, Alex," he said, his tone calm but firm. "I just think there's more to being a leader than pushing people to their limits. It's about creating an environment where people feel supported, where they can be their best selves." Alex's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so? Because last time I checked, business isn't about being nice, it's about winning." Dylan could feel the tension rising in the room, but instead of letting it escalate, he forced himself to stay composed. "Winning is important, sure. But it's the way you win that matters. If you win at the expense of your people, what's the point?" There was a brief silence as Alex processed his words. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, but instead, he just shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in Dylan's demeanor. "Well, I guess we'll see if that approach works for you," Alex muttered, though the challenge in his voice was less sharp than before. Dylan didn't respond. He knew that some people wouldn't understand or accept his changes, but he had learned to stop seeking validation from others. What mattered now was his own growth, and the realization that he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. That evening, Dylan found himself sitting alone in his apartment, reflecting on the events of the day. He had a feeling that his transformation was far from complete. The road ahead would still be filled with obstacles, some external, but many internal. He still struggled with moments of self-doubt, still questioned whether he was doing the right thing, still faced the temptation to revert to his old habits. But something inside him had shifted irrevocably. He thought back to the woman in the park, to Mr. Hamilton's steady presence, to the lessons that had emerged from the unlikeliest of places. He realized that humility wasn't just a temporary shift in behavior. It was a mindset that required daily practice. It was a commitment to seeing the world not just through his own lens, but through the eyes of others. And with that understanding, Dylan made a new promise to himself. He would keep going. He would continue down this path, no matter how difficult, because he knew now that the true reward lay not in promotions or accolades, but in the relationships he cultivated and the impact he had on the lives of others. The next morning, as he stepped into the office, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. He was still the senior manager, still the ambitious go-getter he had always been, but he was now something more, a man willing to learn, to grow, and to lead with compassion. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was no longer defined by his success alone. He was defined by the way he treated others, and that, Dylan realized, was the only success that truly mattered. The unexpected change. Dylan awoke the next morning with a sense of quiet determination. It wasn't the kind of intense drive that had once propelled him to outpace everyone around him, but a more measured, reflective kind of resolve. It was the resolve of someone who had seen a side of themselves they didn't like, and who now understood the work it would take to become better. It was the kind of resolve that comes not from an external goal, but from a deep, internal shift in values. As he prepared for the day, Dylan knew he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that his transformation was already complete. He was aware that the journey ahead would be one of continuous growth. It wasn't going to be easy. After all, habits were hard to break. And the world around him still moved in the same relentless, competitive way. But Dylan had come to realize that he had changed, and even though others might not immediately recognize it, he had to stay true to what he was becoming. The office, as usual, was a beehive of activity. Dylan entered the building with a sense of quiet confidence, not because he was still the senior manager, but because he was beginning to feel aligned with his values. There was no longer the need to carry an air of superiority, to prove something to the people who surrounded him. The mask had started to crack. The first few interactions of the day came and went like any other. He met with a couple of his direct reports, discussed progress on several initiatives, and provided some guidance on upcoming projects. As he spoke to his team members, Dylan found himself looking at them, not as subordinates, but as individuals with unique strengths and challenges. He was truly listening to their ideas, concerns, and feedback for the first time in a long while, and with that shift in perspective came a surprising sense of peace. But it was the afternoon meeting that proved to be the turning point for Dylan. Mr. Hamilton had called the senior management team to a conference room for a strategy session. The agenda was business as usual. Discussions of upcoming projects, projections, and market positioning. Dylan had prepared as he always did, analyzing data and formulating suggestions. But today, there was something different in his approach. As the team sat around the conference table, Dylan couldn't help but notice how disconnected he felt from the usual hustle. The usual intensity of the discussions seemed to fade into the background as he started to tune into the humanity behind the numbers and projections. He caught himself paying attention to the subtle cues, how some of his colleagues were stressed, how others seemed eager to impress, how a few of them appeared disconnected from the work in front of them. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. There was so much more going on than just the work. As the meeting progressed, Mr. Hamilton posed a question to the group. How do we ensure that our company culture continues to thrive as we grow? What are we doing to ensure that the people who work here feel valued? For a moment, there was silence. It wasn't an easy question, and many of the leaders around the table were too busy focusing on the metrics to give it real thought. But Dylan found himself reflecting deeply. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about profits or bottom lines. He was thinking about the people. How could they create a culture where people felt seen, heard, and supported? How could they do more than just push employees to perform? Dylan took a breath, and without fully thinking it through, spoke up. I think we've been so focused on the end results that we've forgotten about the people who make those results happen. We've been measuring success in terms of numbers, but we need to measure it in terms of how we treat the people who get us there. What if we shifted the focus? What if we looked at creating a work environment where people felt like they mattered, not just as employees, but as human beings? The room fell silent. He could feel the weight of their stares, and for a brief moment, Dylan regretted speaking out. Had he gone too far? Was he challenging the very system he had been part of for so long? But then Mr. Hamilton, who had been watching Dylan carefully, leaned forward. His voice was calm, yet there was an edge of something. An openness, perhaps. That's an interesting perspective, Dylan. You're suggesting that we look at the work we do not just from a business angle, but from a human one. Dylan nodded, feeling a quiet sense of conviction growing within him. Exactly. We've built a system that rewards results, but we haven't built a culture that values the individuals who make those results happen. People work better when they feel seen and respected, not just as employees, but as people with lives outside of work. If we want real success, I think we need to start focusing on that. There was a pause in the room. Mr. Hamilton exchanged a glance with a few of the other senior managers, and for a moment, it seemed like they might dismiss Dylan's idea entirely. But then Mr. Hamilton spoke again. I see your point, Dylan. It's not an easy thing to implement, but it's worth thinking about. We need to foster an environment where people feel valued for who they are, not just for what they can do. You've made a good point. Dylan couldn't believe it. In all his years at the company, he had never heard Mr. Hamilton offer such a direct acknowledgement of someone's suggestion, let alone one of his own. The weight of the moment settled over him. And in that instant, Dylan realized something profound. He hadn't just changed. The environment around him was beginning to shift, too. After the meeting, Dylan sat in the conference room for a few moments, his mind spinning. It felt like a seed had been planted, not just in the meeting, but in himself. He had spoken his truth, and Mr. Hamilton had responded. But even more importantly, it felt like he was starting to be the kind of leader who created space for others to be themselves, not just to perform, but to truly be seen. Later that day, Dylan was walking through the office when he saw Jane again. She smiled at him, her usual warm expression filling him with a quiet sense of gratitude. "Hey, Dylan," she said, "you did great in the meeting today. I think you're really starting to change things around here." Dylan smiled back, the words feeling real for the first time. "Thanks, Jane. I think I'm starting to see things differently. Maybe I've been focused on the wrong things for too long." She nodded. "I've noticed. It's good to see this side of you." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. This side of him. That was what had been missing all along. He had built a life centered around his success, his ambition, and his achievements, but it had been hollow. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to build something that was grounded in something real, something that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Dylan continued to work with a renewed sense of purpose. He made it a priority to connect with his team, to be genuinely interested in their lives, to listen when they spoke. And as he did, something remarkable began to happen. The people around him started to open up. They trusted him more, they communicated more openly, and the work environment began to shift. There was still a long way to go, but the foundation had been laid. Dylan had learned that true leadership wasn't about controlling others or pushing them toward a goal. It was about creating an environment where people could thrive, where they could grow not just in their careers, but as individuals. He realized that the best way to inspire others was to lead with compassion, humility, and understanding. And perhaps most importantly, Dylan had learned that change, true change, begins not with the people around you, but within yourself.